They called her Ash-Stained Abby, the girl with blistered hands and nothing to her name but the harsh lye soap she scrubbed with. In the dust-choked boomtown of Oakhaven, Colorado, she was nothing more than the local punchline. So, when Silas Montgomery, a ruthless, wealthy cattle baron who could have claimed any heiress in the territory, strode into the muddy town square and asked the laughingstock laundry girl to be his bride, the whole town thought it was a cruel joke. But Silas wasn't joking, and the reason he chose her? It was a secret buried in blood and ash for 15 years, a secret that was about to blow the town of Oakhaven wide open. The year was 1881, and Oakhaven was a town built on silver veins and spilled blood. But for Abigail Preston, Oakhaven was built entirely of dirty water and soiled linens. Abigail worked behind the sprawling wooden facade of Clara Higgins' Boarding and Laundry. From the moment the sun broke over the jagged peaks of the Rockies until the moon hung high and cold, Abigail was elbow-deep in boiling water. Her hands were permanently stained red, the skin cracked and peeling from the caustic lye soap she used to scrub the grime from the shirts of men who didn't even know her name. Mrs. Clara Higgins, a widow with a heart as hard as a cast-iron skillet, made sure Abigail knew exactly where she stood in the world, at the absolute bottom. Abigail had been orphaned at the age of 7 when her family's wagon was burned on the trail. Clara had generously taken the girl in, a fact she lorded over Abigail every single day while pocketing the wages the girl earned. The town followed Clara's lead. The elite women of Oakhaven, clad in their imported silks and taffeta, treated Abigail like a stray dog. Chief among them was Clementine Sterling, the spoiled, vicious daughter of Mayor Tobias Sterling. Clementine made a sport of Abigail. She would deliberately drag the hems of her dresses through the horse-churned mud of Main Street just to toss them at Abigail's feet, demanding they be spotless by morning. "Try not to bleed on the lace, Abby," Clementine would sneer, twirling a parasol on her shoulder while her gaggle of friends giggled behind their gloved hands. "Though I suppose mud is the only thing you're truly, intimately acquainted with." Abigail never talked back. She couldn't afford to. She just swallowed her pride, took the heavy baskets, and went back to the boiling vats. She dreamed of saving enough pennies to catch a train to San Francisco, but Clara controlled every cent. Abigail was trapped in a prison of steam and soap. Then, the autumn winds brought Silas Montgomery to Oakhaven. He didn't arrive on a stagecoach or a silver-trimmed train car, despite the fortune he supposedly commanded. He rode in on a massive black roan, leading a small train of heavily guarded wagons. Silas was a towering figure of a man, clad in dark wool and worn leather, with eyes like chipped flint and a jawline that looked like it was carved from the mountains themselves. Rumors had preceded him. He had struck a massive copper fortune in Montana. He was ruthless in business, and he was looking to buy up land in Oakhaven. The town immediately fell to its knees. Mayor Sterling threw a lavish, welcoming banquet. Every unmarried woman in a 50-mile radius, especially Clementine, bought new dresses and painted their lips, desperate to catch the eye of the mysterious, brooding millionaire. Abigail, naturally, wasn't at the banquet. She was in the alley behind the laundry, scrubbing the very pots they had cooked the banquet food in. Their first meeting happened 3 days later. A sudden, violent afternoon downpour had turned Oakhaven's streets into a swamp. Abigail was struggling to carry a towering stack of freshly ironed shirts across the boardwalk to the mayor's office. A passing freight wagon took a corner too fast, its heavy wooden wheels plunging into a deep rut. A wave of thick, brown sludge arched through the air and hit Abigail squarely in the chest, knocking her backward. The pristine white shirts scattered into the mud, instantly ruined. Abigail sat in the muck, the freezing water soaking through her threadbare cotton dress. Across the street, standing under the awning of the general store, Clementine Sterling burst into a shrill, piercing laugh. "Oh, look at her. Right where she belongs. In the gutter with the rest of the trash." Abigail felt the hot sting of tears, but she refused to let them fall. She scrambled onto her knees, desperately trying to salvage the ruined shirts, knowing Clara would beat her for the loss. Suddenly, the heavy sound of bootsteps approached, stopping right beside her. The laughter across the street abruptly died. Abigail looked up, squinting against the rain. Silas Montgomery stood towering over her. Up close, His presence was overwhelming. He didn't look at Clementine. He didn't look at the mud. He looked right into Abigail's wide, panicked, hazel eyes. Without a word, Silas shrugged off his heavy, expensive broadcloth coat. He knelt right there in the mud, a millionaire kneeling in the dirt, and draped the dry, warm coat over her shivering shoulders. "Leave the shirts," Silas said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, rough but remarkably steady. I can't," Abigail stammered, clutching the lapels of his coat. It smelled of tobacco, pine, and leather. "Mrs. Higgins, the mayor." Silas stood up, effortlessly pulling Abigail to her feet with one large, calloused hand. He reached into his vest, pulled out a heavy gold double-eagle coin, and tossed it into the mud beside the ruined laundry. "Tell the mayor to buy his own shirts, and tell Mrs. Higgins the rest is for your time." Silas then turned his steely gaze across the street toward Clementine, who was staring, open-mouthed and pale. "Some people," Silas said loudly enough for the whole street to hear, "wear their dirt on the outside. Others have souls so filthy a river couldn't wash them clean." He tipped his hat to Abigail. "Have my coat cleaned, miss. I'll expect it by Friday." As he walked away, Abigail stood frozen in the rain, wrapped in a stranger's coat, feeling a strange, terrifying spark of hope ignite in her chest. By the next morning, the town of Oakhaven was consumed by a single, burning question. Why? Why had the wealthiest man in the territory ruined his trousers kneeling in the mud for ash-stained Abby? The local gossips, led by the ever-vocal Sadie Jenkins and the fiercely jealous Clementine, decided it was a twisted game. Silas Montgomery was a hard man. Perhaps he was simply mocking Abigail in a way they didn't yet understand. Or worse, maybe he was looking for cheap, disposable entertainment. Clara Higgins, however, only saw dollar signs. When Abigail returned with the gold piece, Clara snatched it instantly. "You wash that man's coat until it looks like it was woven by angels," Clara barked. "And you make sure he knows we charge a premium for rush service." When Friday arrived, Abigail carefully folded the heavy broadcloth coat. She had scrubbed the faint mud spots out with a gentle bristle brush, terrified of ruining the expensive fabric. She carried it to the grand suite Silas had rented above the Oakhaven Bank. When he opened the door, he looked tired. His shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and crisscrossed with old, faded scars. He took the coat, inspecting it. "Thank you, Miss Preston." "Sir?" "Abigail Preston," she said softly, keeping her eyes on the polished floorboards. "Miss Preston." Silas stepped back, pulling a wad of bills from his pocket. He handed her 3 crisp $10 notes. It was more money than Abigail saw in a year. "Sir, the bill is only 50 cents, she said, her hands trembling as she tried to hand it back. "The rest is for you, not for Clara Higgins." "Hide it," Silas commanded softly. "And from now on, you are the only one who handles my laundry. You will bring it here yourself. Understood?" Abigail nodded, entirely bewildered. "Yes, Mr. Montgomery." For the next month, the ritual continued. Silas generated an unusual amount of laundry for a man living alone, and Abigail delivered it twice a week. They rarely spoke more than a few words, but a strange, quiet tension began to build between them. Silas would watch her as she arranged his collars, his eyes studying her face with an intensity she couldn't decipher. It wasn't predatory. It was almost searching. The town, meanwhile, was losing its collective mind. Clementine Sterling had thrown herself at Silas at every opportunity, inviting him to private dinners, orchestrating accidental run-ins at the Mercantile. But Silas remained utterly immune to her charms. His coldness toward the mayor's daughter, contrasted with his exclusive patronage of the laundry girl, fueled a toxic resentment in Oakhaven. The boiling point was reached at the town's annual Founders' Day picnic, held in the lush meadow just past the town limits. It was a grand affair. Fiddlers played, sides of beef roasted over open pits, and the town's elite paraded in their finest clothes. Abigail was there, but not to celebrate. Clara had contracted her out to haul heavy buckets of lemonade and clear away dirty plates. As the afternoon sun beat down, Abigail, exhausted and sweating, was carrying a large wooden tray piled high with sticky, discarded glassware. As she passed the shade of a large oak tree where Clementine and her friends were holding court, Clementine saw her opportunity. With a subtle, deliberate flick of her parasol, Clementine hooked Abigail's ankle. Abigail went down hard. The wooden tray shattered against the ground, and dozens of thick glass cups exploded into shards. The sticky lemonade soaked into Abigail's dress and coated her raw hands. A hush fell over the surrounding crowd. Clementine let out a theatrical gasp. "Oh, my heavens! Abigail, you clumsy fool! You've nearly showered us in glass." Laughter rippled through the onlookers. Clara Higgins rushed over, her face purple with rage. "You stupid, useless girl!" Clara screamed, raising a heavy wooden ladle to strike Abigail. "I'll take the cost of this out of your hide." Before the ladle could fall, a large, gloved hand caught Clara's wrist mid-air. Silas Montgomery had appeared from the crowd like a phantom. His grip on Clara's wrist was so tight, the older woman whimpered, dropping the ladle. Silas threw her arm back with a look of utter disgust. He then knelt once again beside Abigail. Ignoring the sticky syrup and the jagged glass, he carefully took her bruised, lye-burned hands in his own. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and began to gently wipe the dirt and lemonade from her skin. "Mr. Montgomery, really?" Mayor Sterling sputtered, stepping forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. "She's just a clumsy servant. You shouldn't dirty yourself." "Shut your mouth, Tobias," Silas said, not even looking up. The crowd gasped. No one spoke to the mayor that way. Silas finished cleaning Abigail's hands, then stood, pulling her up with him. He kept his arm securely around her waist, anchoring her to his side. Abigail was shaking violently, overwhelmed by the humiliation, the pain, and the shocking heat of his hand on her waist. Silas swept his gaze across the silent, staring crowd. His eyes locked onto Clementine, who visibly shrank back. "I have watched this town treat this woman like a beast of burden." Silas's voice boomed across the meadow, sharp as a crack of a bullwhip. "You parade around in your finery, pretending to be civilized, while you grind the only decent soul among you into the dirt." He turned his attention back to Abigail. The hard edge in his eyes softened, replaced by something resolute and surprisingly gentle. "Abigail Preston," Silas said, his voice dropping in volume but carrying perfectly in the dead silence. "I have just closed the deed on the old Miller estate on the ridge. It's a large house, too large for one man." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, elegant gold band. "I am asking you to be my wife. Marry me. And I swear before God and everyone in this miserable town, you will never scrub another floor. You will never suffer a cold night, and no one in Oakhaven will ever dare look down on you again." The meadow erupted into pandemonium. Clara shrieked. Clementine burst into tears of pure outrage. The mayor shouted something incomprehensible. Abigail stared at the ring, then up at Silas. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was a stranger. He was terrifying. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw no pity. She saw an offer of salvation. She saw an escape. "Why?" she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. "Because," Silas replied softly, "you are owed a debt, Abigail, and I intend to see it paid. Will you marry me?" Taking a deep, trembling breath, Abigail looked at the furious faces of the town that had tormented her for a decade. Then she looked back at Silas. "Yes," she said. They were married 3 days later in the dusty parlor of the town's small church. It was the quietest, most tension-filled ceremony Oakhaven had ever witnessed. Mayor Tobias Sterling, serving in his capacity as justice of the peace, read the vows through clenched teeth, sweating profusely under Silas's unwavering, icy glare. There were no flowers, no music, and no well-wishers. The pews were empty, save for Clara Higgins, who sat in the back clutching a handkerchief, mourning the loss of her free labor rather than celebrating a union. Abigail wore a dress of pale blue silk, It wasn't a wedding gown, but it was the finest thing she had ever touched, let alone worn. Silas had it ordered from Denver and delivered by express rider. As she stood beside him, she felt like a fraud, a raven pretending to be a dove. She kept glancing down at her hands. Despite the silk and the new gold band on her finger, her skin was still rough, red, and scarred from years of caustic lie. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Mayor Sterling muttered quickly, slamming his registry book shut, as if the words themselves tasted bitter. "You may kiss the bride." Abigail froze. Silas turned to her. He didn't smile, but his expression wasn't unkind. He reached out, his large hands gently framing her face, his thumbs lightly brushing her cheekbones. He leaned down and pressed a firm, chaste kiss to her forehead. "Come, Mrs. Montgomery," he said, offering his arm. "Let's go home." Home was the Montgomery Manor. Previously, the Miller estate, perched on a rocky ridge overlooking the valley. Silas had spent a fortune renovating it, in a matter of weeks. As their carriage pulled up to the sweeping mahogany doors, Abigail gasped. It was a sprawling Victorian monstrosity of dark wood, turrets, and wide verandas. Inside, it was a world of velvet drapes, polished oak floors, and gas lamps that cast a warm, golden glow. Silas led her up the grand staircase to a massive suite overlooking the mountains. The bed was a towering four-poster draped in heavy quilts. A fire was already crackling in the hearth. "These are your quarters," Silas told her, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "My room is down the hall. I have hired a housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, and a cook. You will not lift a finger in this house, Abigail. If you want anything, clothes, books, a piano, you simply tell me." Abigail stood in the center of the luxurious room, clutching her small carpet bag of meager belongings. "Silas, Mr. Montgomery," she corrected herself. "Silas is fine," he said. "Silas, I don't understand. Why me? You could have had any woman. Women with breeding. Women who know how to host a dinner or converse in French. I only know how to boil water and scrub stains." Silas's jaw tightened. A shadow passed over his eyes, something dark and deeply painful. "Those women," he said quietly, "know nothing of survival. They know nothing of what it takes to endure. You have endured, Abigail. More than you know." Before she could press him further, he tipped his hat. "Rest now. We will dine at 7, and just like that, her new life began. The first few weeks at Montgomery Manor were a surreal dream. Abigail woke up on feather pillows instead of straw. She ate roasted meats and fresh vegetables instead of Clara's watery gruel. Mrs. Gable, a kindly older woman who treated Abigail with genuine respect, applied soothing salves to her hands every night, slowly coaxing the angry red skin back to a normal hue. Yet, the marriage was entirely a facade. Silas was a ghost in his own home. He left before dawn to inspect his cattle herds, or oversee the construction of a new mill he was building near the river. When he was home, he locked himself in his sprawling study on the ground floor. They ate dinner together in the massive dining room, the long mahogany table separating them like an ocean. He was polite, asking about her day, ensuring she was comfortable, but he remained utterly distant. He never touched her. He never sought her out. Abigail, initially relieved by the distance, began to feel a gnawing sense of isolation. The town still shunned her. Being married to a wealthy man didn't erase her past as ash-stained Abby in their eyes. It only made them resent her more. She was a bird in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury but profoundly lonely. And then there was the mystery of Silas himself. Late at night, Abigail would often hear him pacing the floorboards of his study, the heavy thud of his boots echoing through the quiet house. Sometimes, she thought she heard the clinking of a bottle and glass. He was a man wrestling with demons, and she had no idea what they were. The turning point came on a Tuesday, exactly 1 month after their wedding. Silas had ridden out to a neighboring ranch to negotiate a cattle purchase and wasn't expected back until the following evening. Abigail was in the parlor, attempting to read a novel Mrs. Gable had lent her, but she was restless. She decided to dust the bookshelves in Silas's study not because she had to, but because her hands craved the familiar rhythm of work. The study was a masculine room, smelling of leather bindings and stale cigar smoke. As she carefully wiped down his heavy oak desk, she noticed one of the bottom drawers was slightly ajar. Abigail hesitated. It wasn't her place to pry, but an inexplicable tug in her gut urged her forward. She pulled the drawer open. Inside were neat stacks of property deeds, bank drafts, and a heavy iron strongbox. But sitting right on top of the strongbox was something that made Abigail's breath catch in her throat. It was a piece of fabric, a torn, scorched piece of gingham cloth. With trembling fingers, Abigail reached down and picked it up. It was old, the edges frayed and blackened as if it had been pulled from a fire. But the pattern, a distinct checkerboard of pale yellow and cornflower blue, was burned into Abigail's memory. It was the exact pattern of the dress her mother had been wearing the day the wagons were attacked, the day she died. Underneath the scrap of fabric lay a tarnished silver pocket watch. Abigail picked it up. The clasp was broken, but the back was engraved. She rubbed her thumb over the soot-stained metal, revealing the crude, familiar etching. To Jedediah, forever, Martha. Jedediah and Martha Preston, her parents. Abigail dropped the watch onto the desk as if it had burned her. Her heart hammered wildly. Her parents' wagon had been attacked 15 miles outside of Oakhaven by what the sheriff had claimed were renegade bandits. Everything had been burned. How did Silas Montgomery have her mother's dress and her father's watch? Suddenly, the heavy mahogany door of the study clicked open. Abigail spun around. Silas stood in the doorway, drenched in rain, his duster dripping onto the Persian rug. He hadn't stayed overnight at the neighboring ranch. His eyes darted from Abigail's pale face to the open drawer, and finally, to the scorched piece of gingham clutched in her shaking hand. The blood drained from Silas's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. "Abigail," he breathed, taking a slow step into the room. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice cracking, retreating behind the desk. "Silas, where did you get my mother's dress?" Silas closed his eyes, leaning heavily against the doorframe, as if all the strength had suddenly left his massive frame. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like it would snap. When he finally opened his eyes, the cold, impenetrable wall he usually kept up was gone. In its place was a look of profound, agonizing guilt. "I didn't just find you in this town by accident, Abby," Silas said, his voice a hoarse, ragged whisper. "I came to Oakhaven for you, because 15 years ago, I was one of the men who set that fire." The silence in the study was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass panes. Abigail stepped backward until her spine hit the heavy oak bookshelves. The piece of scorched gingham slipped from her numb fingers, fluttering to the Persian rug like a dying moth. "You," she whispered, the word tearing at her throat. "You killed them." "No." Silas surged forward, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the carpet. But he stopped dead when Abigail flinched, throwing her hands up to protect herself. The raw terror in her hazel eyes was a physical blow to him. He raised his hands, palms outward, a gesture of surrender. "I didn't kill them, Abby. I swear it before God." Silas's voice was a desperate, gravelly plea. He looked ragged, the formidable, untouchable millionaire suddenly reduced to a haunted man. "I was 16 years old, a half-starved runaway from an orphanage in Street Lewis. I fell in with a crew of rough stockmen led by a man named Bloody Bill Higgins, Clara's late husband." Abigail's breath hitched. Clara's husband? The man who had supposedly died of cholera before she ever came to the laundry? "We weren't just rustling cattle," Silas continued, his eyes locked onto the floor as the shameful memories bled out of him. "We were hired muscle, hired by a shadow syndicate to clear out the homesteaders in this valley. They wanted the land, the water rights, and the silver deposits underneath. We were told to scare the settlers off, burn a wagon or two. But Bill Higgins, he was a monster. He didn't just want to scare them. He wanted to leave no witnesses. My parents were witnesses," Abigail said, her voice shaking with an icy, terrifying rage. Yes. Silas swallowed hard. When we rode up on your camp, your father, Jedediah, reached for his rifle. Bill shot him before he could even raise the barrel. Then he shot your mother. A ragged sob tore from Abigail's lips. She clamped a hand over her mouth, the lie-scarred skin rough against her face. I was frozen, Silas said, tears finally brimming in his hard, flinty eyes. I had never seen a man killed before. Bill ordered us to torch the wagon. But then, I heard crying from inside the canvas. Abigail remembered the smoke, the searing heat, the terrifying, choking darkness. I defied Bill. I dove into the back of the burning wagon. You were huddled under a pile of woolen blankets, clutching a rag doll. Silas took a tentative step forward. I pulled you out, Abby. I carried you into the brush, away from the fire. Bill and the others were already riding off, thinking I had perished in the flames or run away. I hid with you in the creek bed for 2 days, but I was a wanted outlaw, a penniless boy with a bounty on his head. I couldn't protect a 7-year-old girl. So, I wrapped you in a blanket, carried you to the edge of Oakhaven, and left you on the steps of the church where I knew you'd be found. I kept the piece of your mother's dress and your father's watch so I would never forget the debt I owed. Abigail's mind spun dizzily. He was the monster in her nightmares, yet he was also the phantom savior who had carried her from the flames. You left me, she cried, anger finally breaking through her shock. You left me to be found, and Clara Higgins took me in. The wife of the man who murdered my family made me her slave. Did you know that? Did you know what she did to me? I didn't know, Silas said, his voice breaking. I fled the territory. I went south. I rode the trails with Charles Goodnight in Texas, working myself to the bone. I struck copper in Montana. I became wealthy, powerful, ruthless. All so I could come back here and dismantle the men who destroyed your life. I hired Pinkerton Detective James McParland to dig up the dirt on the syndicate that hired Bill Higgins. I tracked them down. Abby, I know who gave the order to burn your wagon. Abigail stared at him, the pieces of the puzzle violently shifting. Who? Silas's jaw hardened, the millionaire baron returning to his features. Tobias Sterling, your beloved mayor. He was the head of the syndicate. He built Oakhaven on the blood of your parents and dozens of others. Clara Higgins kept you as a twisted form of penance, knowing exactly who you were, paid off by Sterling to keep you quiet, uneducated, and broken. The room spun. Mayor Sterling, the man who had officiated her wedding, Clementine's father. The entire town, her entire life of misery, was a calculated prison built by the men who had orchestrated her family's slaughter. You married me to get back at them, Abigail whispered, a new, agonizing realization dawning. I am just a piece on your chessboard, a pawn to humiliate Tobias and Clara. No. Silas closed the distance between them, ignoring her flinch. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip firm but gentle. I came back for revenge, yes, but when I saw you in the street, when I saw what they had done to you, and how fiercely you still held your head up, the revenge didn't matter anymore. Saving you did, protecting you did. I married you because I couldn't bear to see you suffer another day under their boots. I married you because... He stopped, swallowing the words he clearly felt unworthy to speak. Abigail shoved him away, her scarred hands hitting his chest with surprising force. Don't you dare say you care for me. You built our marriage on a graveyard of lies. She turned and ran. She threw open the heavy study doors, sprinting down the grand hallway and bursting through the front doors of the manor into the freezing, torrential rain. Abby! Silas roared behind her, but she didn't stop. She ran blindly down the muddy ridge path, the cold rain soaking her expensive silk dress, plastering it to her skin. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away from the blood money, the lies, and the crushing weight of the past. Abigail stumbled into Oakhaven a little past midnight. The town was a collection of dark, rain-slicked silhouettes. The mud sucked at her expensive leather boots, threatening to pull her down into the filth she had spent her life scrubbing away. She huddled in the narrow alley between the general store and the livery stable, shivering violently. Where could she go? Clara Higgins was the widow of her father's murderer. Mayor Sterling was the architect of her misery. The sheriff, Jeremiah Cobb, was firmly in Sterling's pocket. There was no justice in Oakhaven. There was only the syndicate. A loud crash from the end of the street made her jump. Lantern lights spilled out from the saloon doors, and a group of men stepped onto the boardwalk. Even through the sheets of rain, Abigail recognized the towering, hulking silhouette of Gideon Hacksaw Pratt, Mayor Sterling's chief enforcer, a man rumored to have killed a dozen men in the Dakota Territory before settling in Oakhaven. "Spread out," Pratt barked over the thunder. "Sterling says Montgomery knows. If the girl is out here, grab her. She's the leverage we need to get Montgomery to sign over the ridge." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Abigail's chest. Silas's investigation hadn't gone unnoticed. Sterling knew Silas was onto him. They were coming for her. She backed deeper into the alley, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her foot caught on a discarded iron horseshoe. She tripped, crying out as she hit the muddy ground. "There!" one of the men shouted. Lantern beams swung violently through the rain, slicing into the darkness of the alley and illuminating Abigail's pale, terrified face. "Well, well," Hacksaw Pratt sneered, stepping into the alley, drawing a heavy Colt revolver from his hip. "Look what the rain washed up. The little laundry rat playing dress-up. Get up, Abby. The mayor wants a word." Two rough hands grabbed her arms, hauling her roughly to her feet. Abigail thrashed, kicking wildly. "Let me go, you murderers!" "Gag her," Pratt ordered, stepping closer. Suddenly, a deafening crack split the night air, louder than the thunder. The lantern in the hand of the man holding Abigail's left arm exploded into a shower of glass and burning oil. The man screamed, dropping Abigail as he clutched his bleeding face. From the shadows at the mouth of the alley, a figure emerged. Silas Montgomery. He held a repeating Winchester rifle braced against his shoulder, the barrel smoking in the rain. He had shed his heavy duster. He wore only a soaked white shirt and his dark trousers, looking every bit the ruthless frontiersman he had once been. "Let my wife go, Pratt," Silas said, his voice a lethal, vibrating baritone that cut perfectly through the storm. Pratt laughed, cocking his Colt. "You're outnumbered, Montgomery. Or should I say, Silas Rust. Yeah, the mayor figured out who you were. The little rat who ran from Bloody Bill. You should have stayed dead in the dirt." "Maybe," Silas said, his eyes utterly devoid of fear. "But I'm taking you with me." The alley erupted in a blinding flash of gunfire. Abigail screamed, dropping to the mud and covering her head. The deafening roar of revolvers and the sharp, rhythmic crack of Silas's Winchester echoed off the wooden buildings. Wood splintered above her head. Men shouted in pain. She looked up just in time to see Silas dive behind a pile of rain barrels. A bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him backward. He grunted, hitting the mud hard, but instantly rolled, bringing his rifle up with his good arm and firing 2 rapid shots. Pratt's remaining thug went down, clutching his chest. Pratt, however, was still standing, advancing on Silas's position, firing wildly. "Silas!" Abigail screamed. She didn't think. The paralyzing fear that had gripped her for 15 years suddenly snapped. She scrambled through the mud, grabbing the heavy iron horseshoe she had tripped over moments before. As Pratt stepped past her, entirely focused on finishing off the wounded millionaire, Abigail swung the iron horseshoe with all the desperate strength of a girl who had spent a decade scrubbing floors and hauling boiling water. The iron connected with the back of Pratt's knee with a sickening crunch. Pratt roared in agony, his leg buckling. As he fell, his gun fired into the dirt. Silas didn't hesitate. He lunged forward from behind the barrels, bringing the heavy wooden stock of his Winchester down hard against Pratt's temple. The enforcer collapsed into the mud, unconscious. The alley fell eerily silent, save for the relentless rain and the ragged breathing of the 2 survivors. Silas dropped the rifle, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He looked at Abigail, panting, his face pale in the dim light of the street lamps bleeding into the alley. Abigail stared at the unconscious men, then at the horseshoe in her trembling, scarred hands. She dropped it, rushing to Silas's side. "You're shot," she gasped, her hands instinctively moving to press against the bleeding wound on his shoulder. It was a clean pass-through, but he was losing blood fast. "We have to move," Silas gritted out, wincing as she applied pressure. Pratt wasn't alone. "The whole town is in Sterling's pocket. They'll be coming." "Where do we go?" Abigail asked, hoisting his good arm over her shoulder, bearing his heavy weight. The betrayal of the past hour was eclipsed by the immediate, primal need to survive. "The livery," Silas breathed. "My horse is there." They limped out of the alley, clinging to the shadows. The livery stable was quiet, smelling of wet hay and manure. Silas's massive black roan, Midnight, snorted nervously as they approached. Working together, they managed to saddle the beast. Silas was growing weaker, his skin clammy. Abigail practically had to push him up into the saddle before scrambling up behind him, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist to keep him upright. "Hold on to me, Abby," Silas rasped, taking the reins in his one good hand. They burst out of the livery doors just as a mob of armed men, led by Mayor Tobias Sterling himself, poured into the street at the other end of town. "There they are. Don't let them reach the pass," Sterling bellowed, pointing his cane like a sword. Silas dug his spurs into the roan's flanks. The horse bolted, its massive hooves churning the mud into a spray as they galloped out of Oakhaven, leaving the corrupt, burning boomtown behind them. They rode blindly into the black, jagged jaws of the Rocky Mountains, the treacherous, winding passes their only hope of escaping the men who wanted them dead. As they ascended into the freezing altitude, the rain turned to driving sleet. Abigail pressed her face against Silas's back, feeling the sticky warmth of his blood seeping through his shirt. He had lied to her. He had been a part of her destruction, but as the town's torches faded into the distance below, she realized one undeniable truth. He was now the only thing keeping her alive. The ascent into the jagged maw of the Rockies was a frozen nightmare. The freezing sleet turned to a blinding snowstorm as Midnight, Silas's massive black roan, fought against the steep, treacherous incline of Dead Man's Pass. Silas slumped forward, his uninjured hand twisting into the horse's mane to keep from falling. His breathing was a ragged, wet sound that terrified Abigail more than the howling wind or the distant baying of Sterling's hounds. "Silas, stay with me," Abigail shouted over the storm. Her arms locked so tightly around his waist, her muscles screamed in protest. She could feel his lifeblood soaking her ruined silk dress, freezing into stiff, macabre patches. "Up ahead," Silas rasped, his voice barely a ghost of its usual commanding boom. The old Blackwood claim. "There's a miner's shack." They found it blindly, a dilapidated structure of rough-hewn pine logs tucked beneath a massive overhang of granite. Abigail practically dragged Silas from the saddle. He collapsed into the snow, his eyes rolling back. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. But the years of suffering under Clara Higgins had forged something unbreakable in Abigail's spine. She was not a weeping heiress. She was a survivor. She hauled Silas inside the freezing, pitch-black cabin, her muscles straining under his dead weight. Working purely on instinct, she stripped the saddlebags from the horse, found a tin of matches, and managed to light a dusty, forgotten kerosene lantern hanging from a rusted nail. The pale light revealed a grim scene. Silas lay on the dirt floor, his face the color of dirty snow. The bullet had passed clean through the meat of his shoulder, but an artery was nicked. He was bleeding to death. "Abby," he whispered, his eyes fluttering open, clouded with pain and impending shock. "In my inner coat pocket. An envelope." "Hush. I need to stop the bleeding," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. She tore the heavy wool of his coat and his blood-soaked shirt away, exposing the ugly, bubbling wound. "Listen to me." Silas coughed, a terrifying rattle in his chest. He weakly fumbled for his pocket, producing a thick, wax-sealed envelope. "This is the Pinkerton file. It has everything on Mayor Tobias Sterling. Bank records, the sworn affidavit of a former syndicate rider, everything Pinkerton agent James McParland found. And a deed. Abigail pressed her hands against his shoulder, her lie-scarred fingers slipping on the hot blood. I don't care about a deed, Silas. You are not dying on me. It's the deed to Montgomery Manor, he insisted, his hand falling weakly to the dirt. But it wasn't the Miller estate, Abby. I lied to the town to keep Sterling in the dark. It was the Preston claim. Your father discovered the richest vein of silver in the territory before he even filed the paperwork. Sterling found out. That's why he sent Bloody Bill to slaughter your family. I bought it back. It's yours. Take the horse. Ride to Denver. Find Governor Frederick Pitkin. Show him the file. He's been looking for an excuse to hang Sterling for years. Tears streamed down Abigail's face, cutting tracks through the soot and mud. The manor, the grand, sprawling house on the ridge, was built on her father's silver. Silas hadn't just saved her. He had spent his entire life, and his massive fortune, painstakingly reconstructing her stolen legacy. I am not leaving you, Abigail said fiercely. She turned away from his protests, her eyes scanning the cabin. There was an old iron wood stove, a rusted bucket, and a pile of dry kindling. The laundry girl went to work. She built a roaring fire in the stove in minutes. She rushed outside, filled the bucket with snow, and set it to boil. From Silas's saddlebags, she retrieved a bottle of high-proof whiskey and a heavy hunting knife. When the water was boiling, she sterilized the knife. She tore the clean, dry remnants of her silk petticoats into strips. This is going to hurt, she told him, kneeling beside him, uncorking the whiskey. Drink. Silas managed 2 swallows before she poured the rest directly into the open wound. He let out a feral, agonizing roar, his body arching off the dirt floor. Abigail didn't flinch. She had suffered lie burns that ate to the bone. She knew the cruel arithmetic of pain and survival. Using the sterilized blade and the boiling water, she cleaned the wound of cloth fibers and dirt, then bound it tightly with the silk strips, tying the knot with savage precision to apply maximum pressure. For the next 10 hours, the storm raged outside. But inside, Abigail waged a war against death. She kept the fire burning, piling every piece of broken furniture into the stove. She huddled next to Silas, wrapping him in the horse's heavy woolen blankets and using her own body heat to fight off his shivering fever. Sometime near dawn, the fever broke. Silas's breathing evened out. He opened his eyes, the hard, flinty clarity returning to them. He looked at Abigail, who was slumped against the wall, exhausted, her hands coated in dried blood, her ruined dress a testament to the night's horrors. You stayed, he whispered, a profound sense of awe in his voice. I gave you the money, the land, and the revenge. You could have walked away from the man who helped burn your world. Abigail looked at him. The hatred and confusion of the previous night burned away by the harsh reality of the cabin. You were 16, Silas. A starving boy. You defied a monster to pull me from the flames. You gave up your peace to build a fortress for me. You didn't burn my world. You are the only one who ever tried to save it. She reached out, her scarred hand resting gently on his unshaven cheek. Silas leaned into her touch, a single tear escaping his eye and tracking through the dirt on his face. In that freezing, blood-stained cabin, the millionaire and the laundry girl finally found the truth they had both been running from. They were no longer bound by a debt of blood, but by an undeniable, fierce love forged in the fire of their shared survival. But the tender moment was shattered by the sharp, terrifying crack of a rifle shot echoing through the canyon outside. The wooden door of the cabin splintered as a second bullet tore through the rotting pine. Montgomery, we know you're in there. The voice of Tobias Sterling echoed over the dying wind, amplified by the rocky canyon walls. Send the girl out with the papers, and I'll let you die quick. Silas tried to sit up, his face grimacing in agony. He reached for his Winchester, but his injured shoulder gave out, and the heavy rifle clattered to the floor. I can't hold it. Silas gritted out, absolute despair washing over his features. Abby, There's a back window. The horse is out of the line of fire. You have to run." Abigail looked at the man she loved, bleeding and broken on the floor. Then she looked at the Winchester. She remembered Clementine Sterling laughing as she scrubbed floors. She remembered Clara Higgins' heavy ladle. She remembered the smoke of her parents' wagon. She walked over and picked up the rifle. It was heavy, the steel cold against her blistered hands. "No," Abigail said, her voice dropping into a deadly calm register that made Silas stare at her in shock. "I am done running from Tobias Sterling." She pumped the lever action, chambering around just as Silas had taught her in the fleeting moments of the shootout in the alley. She moved to the shattered window, peering through the broken glass. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the canyon painted in blinding, pristine white. 50 yards away, behind an outcrop of boulders, Tobias Sterling stood in a heavy fur coat, surrounded by 4 heavily armed men. Hacksaw Pratt, limping but alive, had a shotgun leveled at the cabin door. "I'm losing my patience, Silas," Sterling yelled. "Pratt, burn them out." Pratt struck a match, holding it to a kerosene-soaked rag wrapped around a stick of dynamite. Abigail didn't hesitate. She rested the heavy barrel of the Winchester on the windowsill, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, kicking violently against her shoulder. The bullet shattered the stick of dynamite in Pratt's hand, just as the fuse caught. The explosion ripped through the crisp morning air, sending a plume of black smoke and snow into the sky. Pratt was thrown backward into the snowbank, screaming, his arm mangled. The remaining men scattered in panic, firing blindly at the cabin. "Hold your fire, you fools," Sterling shrieked, ducking behind his boulder. "He's an expert marksman." "It's not him, Tobias," Abigail shouted, her voice ringing out clear and strong over the canyon. "It's the girl you tried to burn." "It's Abigail Preston." A shocked silence descended on the canyon. "You want my father's land," Abigail challenged, pumping another round into the chamber. "You want the silver you killed my mother for? Come and take it from me." Sterling, enraged and humiliated that he was being pinned down by the town's former laughingstock, drew his own revolver. "Rush the cabin. There's only one of her." But before his men could move, a sound echoed from the mouth of the canyon that froze the blood in Sterling's veins. It wasn't the sound of gunfire. It was the rhythmic, thundering rhythm of dozens of horses. Over the ridge rode a column of men in heavy blue coats, silver stars glinting on their chests. At the head of the column rode a man with a fierce mustache and a hardened gaze. United States Marshal David Cook, the most feared lawman in the Colorado Territory. "Drop your weapons, Sterling." Marshal Cook's voice boomed like the wrath of God. "By order of Governor Pitkin, you are under arrest for the murders of Jedediah and Martha Preston and conspiracy to commit land fraud." Silas had not just been riding blindly. Before the confrontation in the alley, he had dispatched his fastest rider to Denver with duplicates of the Pinkerton evidence, straight to Marshal Cook's office. Sterling looked at the dozens of rifles trained on him. The color drained from his face. The corrupt empire of Oakhaven had fallen in a matter of seconds. Slowly, his hands shaking, the mayor dropped his gun into the snow. Abigail lowered the Winchester, leaning her forehead against the cold wood of the window frame. It was over. The ghosts were finally laid to rest. 6 months later, the boomtown of Oakhaven was unrecognizable. Tobias Sterling was awaiting the hangman's noose in a federal penitentiary. Clementine, stripped of her wealth and status, had fled east in disgrace, and Clara Higgins, facing charges of child endangerment and extortion, had mysteriously disappeared into the night, leaving the laundry behind. Abigail Montgomery bought that laundry. She didn't buy it to run it. She bought it to tear it down. Standing in the muddy street, wearing a beautifully tailored riding habit of dark green velvet, Abigail watched as Silas's work crews attached heavy chains to the wooden pillars of Clara Higgins' boarding and laundry. Silas stood beside her, his arm fully healed, wrapped securely around her waist. He looked down at her, his eyes warm and completely devoid of the shadows that had haunted him for 15 years. "Are you sure you want to do this, Mrs. Montgomery?" he asked, a small, proud smile playing on his lips. It's prime real estate. Abigail looked at her hands. The deep red lye stains were fading, replaced by the soft glow of a life lived without cruelty. She looked back at the dilapidated building where she had shed so much blood and tears. "Pull it down," she commanded. With a groan of splintering wood and a cloud of dust, the prison of ash-stained Abbey collapsed into the dirt. In its place, she would build Oakhaven's first free school and orphanage, ensuring no child would ever be left alone in the ashes again. The legend of Abigail and Silas Montgomery became a cornerstone of Colorado folklore, a testament to the enduring power of justice and redemption in the untamed West. Silas, the ruthless cattle baron, transformed his massive fortune into a legacy of philanthropy, heavily guided by the compassion of his wife. Abigail, once the town's most mocked citizen, became the undeniable matriarch of the region, her lye-scarred hands a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. They built their lives upon the very silver her father had discovered, turning a legacy born in blood into an empire rooted in unbreakable love. Their story proved that while the frontier could break a person down to their very ashes, the human spirit, when ignited by truth and genuine devotion, could always rise from the dirt to build something truly magnificent.